We're going to switch gears and do one more content-driven session, in this case with Paul Randall from HP Publishing Solutions. He's works in the product marketing area there and is, we're just bringing him online now.
Brian, hi. Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine, Paul. Thank you for joining us today at the end of your week and the middle of our Friday.
No problem at all. Pleasure to be here. Yeah, so it's getting to end of day Friday. I just hope that we get through the next 30 minutes without my children interrupting as they get into weekend mode.
Well, we haven't had, this has been an interesting annual meeting in that we haven't had any cats, dogs, or children. So if you break the spell, that's fine.
Yeah, well, maybe that's the challenge for me. I mean, can I continue that, or will I entirely disrupt it? Let's see.
Well, let me kick this off. So yesterday was Earth Day, and the President of the United States kicked off a 2-day summit that continues today to consider options that would reduce the impact of climate change around the world. And in this panel, we've heard today from Sherry Aldous about the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the Publishers Compact. And we've heard from the Green Book Alliance, which is a joint effort that BISG, BIC in the UK and BookNet Canada have put together. It's clear to us, I think, not just from this conversation, but from our observations around the industry, that sustainability is a key interest for governments, nonprofits, and commercial companies. But as a public-facing industry whose core products really rely essentially on renewable resources, book publishing may be more sensitive than some sectors to concerns about sustainability. The choices we make, the partners we choose, and how we organize our work affects our carbon footprint both today and going into the future. So I'm glad that you were able to join us today, and I want to welcome you and thank you for making the time to join us from your base in the UK.
Absolute pleasure. Good to be here.
So HP Publishing Solutions is a company that works with a wide range of publishers to help them rethink their supply chains for printed products. I'd love to be able to tap into your experience today with a few questions that I hope can shape our industry's thinking about sustainability options. And the first one I had was, what are some of the challenges that we face in trying to work to reduce our carbon footprint?
So I've listened to some of the previous sessions with interest, and let me just place a caveat to say that I'm going to repeat, I think, a lot of the thinking and the narrative that's already been offered up today from Sherry and Karina and various others. In terms of the challenges that are being faced, there's a few things that we're really starting to note and becoming aware of. So clearly, sustainability as a topic, as a challenge that the industry is trying to address, is hugely significant. But that boils down into a number of different factors. Clearly, waste is something that the industry has looked to manage and has accelerated and increased its use of print on demand. Inventory management is another element of the end-to-end book publishing supply chain, which again, the industry has tried to address with its increasing use of print-on-demand capability. The other element that I think still needs to be somewhat addressed, and that there is still huge scope to address further, is the one of book miles and the impact of distribution and shipping costs. And I think Sherry particularly made reference to that fact earlier. And from our perspective, I think that is an area whereby there is still a lot of opportunity to further develop the print on demand capability that exists to incrementally improve on sustainable impact, and really look at that whole idea of book miles and producing much closer to the point of market demand.
That feels like it's a fair amount to overcome. I mean, how do we rebuild a supply chain for physical books?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, and I'm not going to sit here and naively suggest that it's, you know, there's a silver bullet or there's an easy way to address that. It needs to be broken down piece by piece. Clearly, you know, publishing supply chains have been built to deliver scale and to deliver efficiency, and, you know, have been things that have been finessed, I guess, and reshaped and built over a large space of time. So it's not something that you can necessarily change overnight, and it's going to take the perspective, input, view of multiple stakeholders within an organization. You know, one of the big things that we try to address, and one of the key conversations that we think needs to be had, is around that total landed cost or fully landed cost and total supply chain cost, and looking at all of the elements. You know, we've talked about waste, we've talked about inventory. Now, one of the challenges, those different cost pools are often managed by different functions, different departments that have different KPIs. And therefore, it's not always easy to bring those together in one kind of singular conversation and one singular analysis. But you know, that is something that, you know, needs to be done and needs to be looked at more and more. You know, the other thing is that I guess, you know, publishers can't always necessarily control the practices of their suppliers, but that again is something that we see happening more and more as publishers are really starting to, I guess, analyze and interrogate, but it's too strong a word, but really look at understanding that the practices of their suppliers. So, you know, in there's that whole thing around collaboration. There's multiple stakeholders, both internal to a publisher and external within their supplier base, and collectively we've got to look at that. I think, you know, probably as well, it's a good point to reinforce the work that's being done by, you know, the BISG, BIC, and the Green Book Alliance that was talked about today. That fundamentally is, you know, pulling together different companies, different individuals, and looking at a big problem collaboratively to try and break down those smaller pieces and really hopefully make some difference.
You know, a moment ago, and I should have stopped you when you did it, you used a phrase that I don't think we've introduced just yet about the book miles. So maybe take a moment just to explain, because I think folks may not necessarily be familiar. It's more commonly used in the UK than it has been here.
Okay, so yeah, absolutely. I mean, so building on that, you know, the notion of, I guess, a philosophy that we would like to promote more and more is this idea of think global but print local. And again, you know, print on demand clearly is not a new technology. You know, we've made reference to the fact that, you know, every publisher will have a print on demand capability process. What we think is often the case, though, is that print on demand capability is still traditionally with you know, normal suppliers, normal supply chains, and is typically centered around one or two suppliers on a global basis. So, you know, what we're really looking at with this whole notion of think global, print local is really how you can localize that production to the best possible extent. How can you print closest to the point of demand, and how can you reduce the book miles, the shipping, the transportation that is undertaken from production to point of you know, retail or distribution, and ultimately getting into the hand of the consumer. So we've been undertaking some work, and I've kind of deliberately used this as my backdrop with reference to a white paper that we've just released, which is looking at really trying to look at some typical you know, supply chain routes, and looking at the book miles and subsequently the you know, the environmental impact that is undertaken by those books in covering those miles. And again, I'll lean on some of the research that you have done. I think it might be a research piece that you've done some years ago, but I think your outcome and analysis was that around 8 pounds of carbon dioxide are emitted for every single book that's manufactured. Yeah. You then overlay that, I think, with something that Sherry mentioned this morning, in that, you know, shipping and distribution has a significant impact on that, you know, environmental aspect as well. If you look at the fact that, you know, 700 million books are produced in, or sold, I should say, in the US, you know, where are those books coming from? What is the book miles that those are undertaking, and how can we more positively address that? And just one last example, I read a piece, it's a couple of months ago, a lady called Karina Horitz, who's from the Budapest Museum of Fine Arts. I hope I've got that right. But during the early stages of lockdown, her supply chain was massively affected by the lockdown and the inability to access their normal suppliers. And she undertook a piece of research. She looked at their catalogue, she looked at where they're produced, and she looked at the book miles, the distance that those books were covered, or covering, I should say, to get to her. And typically the books they produce within the EU are covering nearly 3,000 kilometers. The books outside of the EU are covering nearly 10,000 kilometers. So when you start looking at those distances of travel, and if you start looking at, you know, the impact of carbon emissions on that bigger conversation around sustainability and environmental impact, then, you know, clearly there's an opportunity to try and reduce those book miles. And again, you know, this notion of think global, print local is something we think can really help support that.
Thank you for that. And I just wanted to add that Jonathan Fiedler, who's our operations manager and is kind of working in background today, feverishly actually, has posted in the chat a link to the white paper that you just referred to.
Great. Excellent. Thank you for that.
So I mean, I think you have a sense that there's some cost and sustainability benefits available with this essentially think global, print local approach. I mean, what's your assessment of what the upside is if we can get a supply chain that looks more like that?
So again, I don't want to, I guess, be trying to position us as the wisdom of all knowledge. I mean, we've done some work with some publishers that we're engaged with today, and really tried to look at that total landed cost conversation, and, you know, looking at the cost to a business around, you know, scrapping, inventory management, distribution, warehousing, and all of those elements. Again, not saying that this applies to everyone, but on occasion, with some of the analysis that we've done with specific publishers, that there's up to 20% of that cost structure in that fully landed cost stack that we think can be certainly reduced to a large extent, if not removed. So there's significant cost opportunity there in removing some of those areas. Again, you know, it's something that will take the commitment of a business and multiple functions to look at, but you know, that's the type of figure that we've seen in some instances.
Well, I think, and just as an observation, I mean, I appreciate that you're trying to be balanced in your presentation of what the potential upsides might be. But I mean, part of advocating for a change in how we do our work, how we make the industry more sustainable, does, you know, require the kind of analysis that you've been able to do. So I appreciate your willingness to be here and share it today. I know that you, in the white paper in particular, you spent some time estimating the environmental cost of unsold inventory, which is a big piece of the puzzle when it comes to thinking about printing locally. The example that I recall looking at was one publisher that had scrapped $100 million in print books. What was your take on the impact of that? I mean, how does that, what's 100 million print books, or $100 million rather, in print books look like when it comes to the environment?
Yeah, I mean, that's really the interesting point, is when you look at that from the perspective of what that equates to in other areas. So you know, some of the numbers that we saw there, you know, what that $100 million kind of boiled down to, when you look at some of the component parts of that supply chain, I think it was in excess of 500,000 trees would have been required for the production of that content. Enough energy to power, I think it was 10,000 homes for a year, enough water to fill 650 swimming pools, and I think it would have filled something like 2,000 rubbish trucks. So, you know, you start looking at it in, I guess, a sense of more tangible ways, and it really brings into perspective the size and scale. Now again, you know, print on demand is being used more and more and more. So we'd expect that to be positively addressed and reduced. But you know, it's quite a sobering thought when you start to see some of those numbers.
It is sobering, but I think you also have examples of companies that are taking steps now that are instructive for what the industry can be thinking about.
Absolutely. I mean, as everybody has kind of remarked today, with World Earth Day in the last couple of days, I think 2 days ago, to coincide, or yesterday, I should say, not 2 days ago, Penguin Random House in the UK announced its imperative to be carbon neutral across its operations. I think by 2040, if I remember rightly. So making a significant pledge, looking at, and it's a number of different things. It's looking at things like their offices and their warehouses and the emissions linked to that. But equally within that, there are elements around supply chain. So it's a number of factors that will address that imperative or that desire to become carbon neutral. But they're one of many. I think Springer Nature recently signed the climate pledge. So again, there's a commitment from them to be carbon neutral, I think, by again 2040. It's a growing sense of, again, collaboration, I guess is the word I keep coming back to, with a number of organizations looking at this. There's been for many years a number of publishers looking at the need to use FSC certified stocks and media's Scholastic, Penguin Random House. A number of organizations have looked at that. So the level of focus, the level of attention that it's getting is building, and it's building through multiple elements through the supply chain. And one of the other things I think is really particularly interesting is if you look at some of those bigger publishing organizations now, there are relatively new job titles, I guess, that perhaps wouldn't have existed a relatively short space of time ago. So you're seeing chief sustainability officer, you're seeing head of ethical supply chain, sustainability, and so on. So clearly there's a sense within those companies that this is something they have to address, are addressing, and they're creating very senior management roles within their organizations to actually do that.
And I think you also called out in part of your overview that the Book Manufacturers Institute, BMI, which is based here in the US, has added environmental certification to their online directory, which gives publishers and other people who would use the printers a way to search for printers with FSC, SFI, or other certifications, and to potentially find printers who might be using, for example, soy-based inks. So.
Sure, absolutely. And I know as well there was a report, I think, from the Governance and Accountability Institute, which looked at the Russell 1000 index and looked at the number of companies within that index that have sustainability projects and commitments underway. And it continues to increase. I think it's up to 90% of the top 500 companies now have stated goals in that area. Yeah,
there's clearly a groundswell in that regard. I think you were on earlier when we talked a little bit about, I think Sherry mentioned it, and as well, we talked about it for the Green Book Alliance about developing vendor checklists. It's one of the things that we've heard clearly as an opportunity for the Alliance. But you started down that road already, and you've been developing questions that you suggest publishers ask their manufacturing partners. What kinds of things are on your list?
Yeah, and again, we can't take total credit for this. Actually, what we're seeing is more and more that a lot of publishers are asking these very questions, So this is not kind of a thinking that's exclusive to us, but is really something that the industry at large is looking at when liaising and working with the supplier base. So it's some of the things that I already mentioned. What are the corporate and environmental commitments of those print providers and those suppliers? What percentage of their materials are sourced through ethical sources? What percentage of those materials are recycled? What are the processes, the printing processes, the materials, the inks? What are those manufactured from? How are they made? What is the impact of those? The obvious around I guess print runs and minimum volumes, and how that can positively have a role to play. And then what we're seeing more and more actually, which I think comes back again to the notion, the idea of think global and print local, is a question around what markets can those partners serve? What is their geographical footprint, and subsequently what might be the impact of needing to transport materials around. So it's an increasing focus, I think, across the industries. I mean, you said there's a groundswell, but absolutely there's a groundswell. And more and more publishers are looking at those elements when working with their suppliers.
And I think it's interesting because we've been trying to think through these issues, maybe not for the first time, but as Tyler Carey and Patricia Stocklin said in their top 10 list a few minutes ago, it's okay to borrow from other people. You don't have to have invented the idea yourself. But
I'm glad you said that.
Yeah, it's just there's opportunities, for example, to look regionally or geographically and say, are there certifications that are already in place, whether it's in a given country and we can bring it to another. That's part of what we were thinking about with the Green Book Alliance was, it's okay to us that UK is ahead. At any given time, some other organization is going to be ahead or behind you. And it's unlikely that you're going to move in lockstep. So whoever's doing better provides the example that makes the rest of us more adept at dealing with an issue, in this case, sustainability. And I think as well, just asking vendors questions, having a checklist gives folks a starting point for a conversation they may not have had in the past. So. You had started to talk a moment ago about overall trends in corporate social responsibility, and you mentioned the Governance and Accountability Institute and the Russell 1000 Index. What do you think is happening within book publishing? Or is the Publishers Compact kind of the outside example of it, or are you seeing greater uptake in the publishing community in other ways?
Well, listen, I think the publishing industry is leading the way largely in this. I mean, what's quite interesting is, I've worked for HP within the graphics organization for a number of years, 15, 16 years now. And digital print technology at its core is around short run capability, on demand capability. Digital print in its very essence is about print only what you need when you need. And I've been involved in a number of different print markets, if you like, the packaging industry, signage industry, direct mail industry, looking at our technology and how it applies in that space. And I have to say, I think, so the notion of sustainability and the notion of print only what you need when you need is evident in all of those. But I don't honestly think there is the collectible or the collective kind of sense of responsibility that I see today within the publishing industry. All of these things that we've referenced, just the very conversations that have taken place within this session today from all of the different presenters gives you a clear indication of the sense of ownership and responsibility that's been taken by the publishing industry. So I think, in reality, it's taking a very positive, a very leading stance on this and really trying to drive, positive change in that respect. And in that instance, is something of something of a role model in really how it's looking at it. Not to say that it, the whole thing's been solved and it's been cracked, but certainly in how the industry is looking at it and devoting significant attention to it.
Yeah, I think if it had all been solved, we wouldn't need to have a meeting on it.
No, for sure.
So there is an upside. Paul, I really appreciate you making time to talk with us today. I'm wondering if you have something you want to leave us with as a closing takeaway, for our attendees and also for BISG as we think about this topic.
There's one word I've used repeatedly, I think, and that's that idea and that notion of collaboration. I think we have to collectively come together and look at this as an industry, exactly what you're doing today, and from HP's perspective, if we look at the wider HP, the philosophy of the company all the way back to early 1930s or mid 1930s when the organization was started, was about to do good was to do well, and it was about the betterment of society and using technology and solutions to make life better. But that really relied on, again, the notion of collaboration and looking at how technology and solutions could apply to industries and markets. It takes two sides for that to be the case, and I think that really that is the notion that we need to look at and how we can positively address this and influence it moving forward. We are fully committed to being part of the conversation, but it's a conversation that needs to be had by many parties, and we just want to be able to play our part in that, whatever that part may be.
Well, thank you for that, and also thank you for making time, as you indicated, at the end of your week, and for being part of this meeting today, listening to the conversations that preceded us. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity, both with you and with your colleagues in the United States and in Europe, to do more together on this topic.
I hope so.
Yeah, thanks. So for the, we're going to take a brief break, about 5 minutes, bring Andrew Savickas, who's our board chair, back and have a brief business meeting where we'll share some of the information. I do want to